is you. Okay, sorry about that. Hey, we're back, but yeah.
Back to my dad. All my dad would love to do is he'd print these certificates and he'd congratulate chefs that were, because he's part of this culinary institute thing, right, where they give chefs awards, and he hated doing that on Windows. When I showed him, and I would always give him support when they had their Windows systems, and finally they wanted to do an upgrade, and I said, well, you know what? Why don't you try out OS 10 to see if you like it. If not, I'll put Windows on the Mac for you. And they got into it, and I showed my dad once using Pages, which is the equivalent to Word,
right,
on the Mac, and I only had to show him once, and I was so impressed that he picked it up one time, and now he printed out all these chef certificates and all that stuff, and he's able to do the email and everything, and so it was fantastic. Now, that experience lasted up until the point when I upgraded their iMac to Snow Leopard, which was an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it. I went up, I did a webcast on it, I did a video on it. Snow Leopard literally, when I put it on there, wiped out all their applications. It had question marks on every application in their dock. I couldn't even, and I went through Terminal.
No. In some ways, Snow Leopard has. It's one of those things. I'm surprised nobody's talking about it. To be honest, because Snow Leopard and QuickTime 10 have caused a lot of the issues like you're talking about, and it's one of those things. It's actually another thing in the recent series of just. It's not because. Apple's bread and butter is they make it drop dead simple and then charge out the wazoo for it. And all these issues in and of themselves are not major things. The problem is when you're catering specifically to a user base who your in philosophy is they should know nothing about how their computer works at all. These issues are not minor issues. These issues are, throw this thing away out the window, get it out of my sight. Because they don't understand that it's only a minor issue. They're like, it's broke, I don't want it anymore.
Exactly. If something blows up on a computer, my dad's ready to pitch it. And now I've installed Snow Leopard on my Mac Mini. And it upgraded beautifully. And
well, the same thing with the QuickTime 10. It depends what you're using. It's like
let me tell you, I had 3 failed upgrades on Snow Leopard, and I have not had one upgrade failure on Windows 7. Which, I mean, I did a webcast on it, I did a video, I was like, wow, first time for me that Windows was...
Well, okay, it should be noted, though, before we bash Apple too much on this and bash Windows, you have the same kind of experience going to Windows 7 if you're trying to do an upgrade from XP. Because XP will force a full system wipe and repartition.
Okay. It's been from Vista.
Yeah, from Vista, because it will allow the upgrade and everything to just perfect.
But Snow Leopard upgraded perfectly on my Mac Mini, and I have Snow Leopard on a partition on my workstation Mac Pro here, not on a partition, on a separate drive. My main development drive, I'm not going to upgrade to Snow Leopard. I can't afford to go through hula hoops, although I could probably install it, see how it goes, and then just restore from a backup image. And that's exactly what I did for my parents. So
well, yeah, but like what you're talking about, you're a geeky person, and you're considering not even futzing with it. So what are people like your dad looking at? I hate to say it, but in some ways with Snow Leopard, Apple may have a Vista on their hands.
Yeah, had I not been there, Lord, my parents would have probably just completely and utterly thrown the iMac out of the house. But they love it as it is, and I know so many people complain about price points and things. And I, as a geek knowing specs, agree that there are a big marginal price increase.
Well, and that's like what I was saying earlier with like they've made their bread and butter off of this. In some ways, I feel like what the Apple culture, like you're talking about, has transitioned from. It's transitioned from we want the underdogs and the anti-people and the people who just want a good system and are willing to pay for it, to people who don't know anything about a system, so they have no idea how much we're overcharging them. And it's...
Well, okay, fair enough, but the thing of it, I think that people do know. A lot of consumers are going to look at a Dell, and then look at the consumers are at least smart enough to say, here's an HP, here's a Dell, here's an Apple, and they weigh their options. I think that people pay more for a lot of that seamless experience. At least my wife, for an example, loves OS X for managing all of her media and photos and how it does it and publishing out. And she's done that same on Windows. Because she comes from a Windows background, being in accounting, everything at work is Windows. But she enjoys the Mac environment and doesn't mind paying to have the ecosystem that it provides. And yeah, hardware-wise, you're paying for more spec for spec.
Well, here's the thing I would argue. If you actually do a true comparison to like, you realize it. But I think the experience the average end consumer has, because most of us do not have a Fry's. As those of us who have been in a Fry's and know what a Fry's is, we're like, if you're in a town where there's a Fry's, instantly the average knowledge of technology just begins to rise, because they can actually just look at it all themselves and they're like, oh, I get it now. But if you don't have a Fry's, your experience in this stuff is the Best Buy experience. And you walk in there and you have you'll walk in there and you'll have the $500 e-machine versus the $700 Mac Mini. That is not a like-to-like comparison. And you're looking at it, it's like, well, the Mac's a few more bucks, and on this demo, a few hundred more bucks, and on this demo I'm messing with, wow, it's just so much better and faster and stuff. And to the average consumer, they don't get that that's because this is a Duo versus this really cheap, underpowered. I'm not sure the average consumer, especially when it comes to a Mac, really realizes that that's part of where that difference comes from, because that's their experience. They're not sitting there in a store comparing two like-to-like machines.
Okay, but I would say that there's a lot of the recent Mac growth comes from a lot of switchers, which come from a Windows environment. And I think that a lot of them...
Yeah, they definitely capitalized on Vista.
And I think that people, they're the consumer, and they can decide. You know, they come from a Windows environment. They obviously know what they were paying before for whatever OEM they decided, and they're going to pay a little more. And it's going to backfire on Apple if Apple doesn't live up to the experience, and they start experiencing some hiccups like they did in Windows. And that drove them to the Mac. But if Apple keeps their hands on it and they can keep that experience going well for the user, I think the consumers are going to say, well, you know what? I haven't had any complaints, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and I'll remain an Apple customer coming from Windows. And Macs aren't terribly more expensive where it's such an exorbitant amount. I've always said that Macs have a unique form factor.
Realistically, it's now some of them it's as much as $1,000, but realistically today it's about a 30% extra in a comparable pound-to-pound system.
Well, on some of them, I remember when I did some comparisons that, for instance, that if you go into super high-end models, and especially if you order more RAM, which I never suggest going through an OEM anyway, I've always recommended bare bone Macs and then upgrade to third parties. But there is
on that note, that was actually something I wanted to go into. It's more and more what companies are starting to do, because they realize that they're raping people on things like hard drives and RAM, is they're starting to say, if you open your case, you void the warranty.
Yeah.
Is Apple playing that route? Do they freak out if you go get Kingston memory, which is infinitely cheaper than Apple memory in so many ways? Okay.
Because I've upgraded my MacBooks, I've upgraded my Mac Pros.